The sun hung at its peak over Silver Ridge, Colorado, casting hard shadows on the dusty main street. September 1876. The kind of day when the heat made men slow and cautious, when smart folks stayed indoors and let the world settle its business without them. But today the whole town had gathered. Ethan Blackwood stood in the center of that street, his right hand hanging loose at his side, fingers relaxed but ready. The Colt 45 on his hip caught the sunlight, the worn leather of the holster dark with years of use. His eyes gray as storm clouds never left the three men facing him 30 yards away. Victor Hartley stood flanked by two hired guns from Denver, men with dead eyes and quick hands, the kind who killed for money and slept soundly after. Victor's face was twisted with rage and something else, desperation maybe, the look of a man who'd gambled everything and watched his cards turn bad. Behind Ethan on the schoolhouse steps, Grace Hartley stood with her hand pressed against her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant. Her dark hair was pulled back severe, her face pale but defiant. The whole town watched her like she was something unclean, something that needed to be driven out before it could spread. They'd already tried once. Now Ethan Blackwood stood between them and their judgment. The wind died, the street went quiet. Somewhere a horse stamped and blew nervous at the tension thick as smoke in the air. Victor's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. "Blackwood, give her to me. The child belongs to the Hartley family." Ethan's response came low and steady, carrying down the street like distant thunder. "Over my dead body, Thomas asked me to protect his wife and child. I don't break promises to dead men." A bitter laugh from Victor. "Thomas died because he was weak. You'll die because you're a fool." Victor's hand moved toward his gun. Ethan moved faster. The sound of a single gunshot cracked across Silver Ridge, echoing off the false-fronted buildings and rolling out toward the mountains beyond. But to understand why a solitary cowboy would stake his life on a widow accused of shame, why he'd stand alone against wealth and power and an entire town's judgment, you have to go back. 6 months earlier, to when it all began with a campfire promise and a brother's dying request. The past always catches up. In the West, it just does it faster. 3 months before the reckoning. March 1876. High country 10 miles from Silver Ridge. The campfire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the Colorado night. Ethan Blackwood and Thomas Hartley sat on opposite sides of the flames, their horses picketed nearby, the smell of coffee and wood smoke mixing with the sharp pine scent of the mountains. They'd been doing this since they were boys. 15 years of riding together, working cattle, facing down storms and rustlers and all the hard things the frontier could throw at men who chose this life. Brothers, though no blood tied them. Something stronger than blood. Something forged in shared danger and kept promises. Thomas Hartley was 28, broad-shouldered and easy with a smile. The kind of man people liked on sight. He had his father's ranch now, 3,000 acres of the best grazing land in 3 counties, and a silver mine that pulled ore from the mountain like drawing water from a well. He had everything a man could want. But tonight, firelight dancing on his face, Thomas looked troubled. "Ethan." His voice cut through the night sound, serious in a way that made Ethan look up from cleaning his rifle. "I need you to promise me something." Ethan set the rifle aside, gave his full attention. When Thomas used that tone, it mattered. "Say it." Thomas stared into the fire, choosing his words careful. "If something happens to me, Grace and the baby, you'll protect them." The question hung between them like smoke. Ethan felt something cold touch the back of his neck. Not the wind, something else. "What makes you think something's going to happen?" "Victor." Thomas said his brother's name like a curse. "My brother's been different lately. The way he looks at me, like I'm standing between him and something he wants, has to have." Ethan knew about Victor. Older by 10 years, bigger, harder. Their father had left 70% of everything to Thomas, the son he'd groomed to carry the family name. Victor got 30% in a lifetime of resentment. That kind of poison worked on a man, changed him from the inside. "Victor's always been jealous," Ethan said, "but he's your blood. Blood doesn't mean what it used to." Thomas pulled a stick from the fire, watched the end glow red. "Grace is pregnant now, due in 5 months. A son, probably. My heir. That means Victor will never have a chance at the ranch, at the mine, at any of it. And Victor knows it. The wind shifted, blowing smoke toward Ethan. He moved, settling on a rock closer to Thomas. You think your own brother would hurt you for money. Thomas looked up, and in his eyes Ethan saw real fear. Not for himself, for Grace and the child she carried. I think Victor would do whatever it takes to get what he believes is his. And I think if I die, he'll find a way to take everything, including my family. Silence except for the fire and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. Ethan reached out, gripped Thomas's shoulder. If anything happens, I'll protect them. Grace and the baby, like they were my own. You have my word. Not just your word. Thomas pulled out his knife, the blade catching firelight. The old way. Blood oath, like the first cowboys did. Ethan pulled his own knife. They'd done this once before, years back, when they'd pledged to watch each other's backs through a hard winter in a range war. That winter had nearly killed them both, but they'd survived because of the bond. Thomas cut his palm, first a quick slice that brought dark blood welling up. Ethan did the same, feeling the sting and then the warm flow. They gripped hands, blood mixing, and spoke the words together like a prayer. Brothers by choice, bound by blood, until death and beyond. Thomas's grip was strong, his eyes locked on Ethan's. If something happens to me, you'll know what to do. Protect Grace, protect my child. Don't let Victor destroy what I'm trying to build. I swear it, Ethan meant every word. They broke the grip, wrapped their hands in bandanas. The fire burned lower. Above them, stars wheeled through the vast Colorado sky, cold and distant and uncaring about the promises men made in firelight. 3 weeks later, Thomas Hartley was dead. March 25th, 1876. Ethan was moving cattle through the south pasture when young Billy Chen came riding hard, his horse lathered and blowing. The boy was 14, worked odd jobs around the ranches, and right now his face was white as winter snow. Mr. Blackwood, the words tumbled out before he could properly rein in. It's Thomas Hartley. He's dead, sir. They found him at the silver mine. The world tilted. Ethan grabbed the saddle horns, steadying himself, even though he was already standing on solid ground. What happened? They say his horse threw him. Midnight trampled him. Sheriff's up there now. Ethan was on his horse before the boy finished talking. He rode hard for the mine, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had heard. Thomas Hartley was the best horseman in 3 counties. Midnight was the gentlest, most loyal animal Ethan had ever seen. A horse Thomas had raised from a colt trained with patience and care. It didn't make sense. The mine cut into the mountainside like a wound timber supports, holding back tons of rock and earth. Thomas's body lay in the open area near the entrance, covered with a blanket. Sheriff Coleman stood nearby, writing in a small notebook. Midnight was tied to a post 20 yards away, the horse still trembling and wild-eyed. Ethan dismounted, walked to the body. His boots crunched on gravel. The sound seemed too loud. Don't, Ethan. Sheriff Coleman moved to block him. It's not good. Ethan pushed past, knelt down, pulled back the blanket. Thomas's face was unmarked, peaceful almost, but his chest was caved in, crushed by the impact of iron-shod hooves. Blood had soaked through his shirt, already drying dark in the mountain air. His eyes were closed. Someone had done that at least, given him that dignity. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled the blanket back into place. He stood turned away, and for a long moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Just stood there with the weight of loss crushing down on him like the mountain itself. Then training took over. Army Scout training from years back when he'd tracked Apache raiders through desert country and learned to read signs most men would miss. He started looking. The ground around the body told part of the story. Midnight's hoof prints, deep and chaotic, showing panic. Thomas's boot prints leading from his horse to the spot. But there was something else. Another set of prints made by boots bigger than Thomas wore. Heavier. Someone who'd stood right here watching, then walked away toward the trees. Ethan followed the trail. 20 yards into the scrub oak, he found where a second horse had been tied. Deep prints in the soft earth where the animal had shifted weight waiting. Broken twigs at chest height. A piece of brown cloth snagged on a branch. Thomas always wore blue, never brown. And there was something else. A smell faint but unmistakable to a man who'd spent years in the army. Gunpowder. Not fresh, maybe half an hour old, but there in the air like a ghost. Ethan stood in that clearing, putting the pieces together. Someone had been here. had fired a shot to spook Midnight. The horse had panicked, reared thrown Thomas, then trampled him while the shooter rode away clean. This was murder dressed up as accident. He walked back to where Sheriff Coleman stood. This wasn't an accident. The sheriff looked up surprised. What? Someone was here. Shot off a round to spook the horse. Thomas fell. Horse trampled him. Then the killer rode off. Ethan pointed toward the trees. You can see the tracks. Other boot prints. Smell the gunpowder if you know what you're looking for. Sheriff Coleman's face went carefully neutral. The look of a man who'd just been handed a problem he didn't want. Now, Ethan, don't go jumping to conclusions. Accidents happen. Thomas probably startled the horse somehow. Midnight doesn't spook. You know that. Even good horses can have a bad day. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small group rode in, led by Constance Hartley, Thomas's mother. 60 years old, dressed all in black like she'd known this day was coming. Her face was stone, giving away nothing. She dismounted with the help of her foreman, walked to the body, looked down at her son without touching him, without kneeling, without any sign of the grief that should have broken a mother's heart. Sheriff Coleman, her voice was crisp, commanding, I want this matter closed. My son died in a tragic accident. There's no need for an investigation that will only bring pain to the family. Ethan stepped forward. Mrs. Hartley, with respect, this wasn't an accident. Someone killed Thomas. She turned those cold eyes on him. Mr. Blackwood, I understand you and Thomas were friends. I know grief makes men see conspiracies where there are only tragedies. But I won't have wild accusations thrown around. My son is dead. Let him rest in peace. But the evidence shows a man thrown from his horse. She turned to the sheriff. Isn't that correct, Sheriff Coleman? The sheriff hesitated, looked at Ethan, then back at Constance Hartley. The richest woman in the county. The woman who paid his salary through her taxes. The woman who could make his life very difficult if she chose. Yes, ma'am. Appears to be an accidental death. Ethan felt rage building hot in his chest. You're not even going to look. Not going to follow the evidence. There's no evidence of foul play, Coleman said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. I'm sorry, Ethan. Thomas was your friend. But this is how it is. Constance Hartley gave orders for the body to be transported back to town for burial. She remounted her horse, looked down at Ethan one last time. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you accept what has happened and move on. Conspiracy theories help no one. She rode off, taking Thomas's body with her. Ethan stood in that mining camp as the sun climbed higher and made a silent promise to the friend he'd failed to protect. I'll find who did this. I'll make them pay. And I'll keep my oath. I'll protect Grace and your child, no matter what it can. The first promise would take time. The second would cost him everything. Thomas Hartley's funeral happened on a gray day, with rain threatening but never quite falling. The whole town turned out not because they loved Thomas, but because the Hartleys were rich and powerful, and attendance was expected. Ethan stood at the back of the crowd, watching the mahogany coffin being lowered into earth that had been opened like a wound. Reverend Marshall spoke words about God's will and eternal rest, but Ethan barely heard them. His eyes were on the woman in black standing closest to the grave, Grace Hartley. Thomas had married her a year ago, scandalizing half the county. She wasn't from, money wasn't from an old family, just a school teacher from Boston who'd come west looking for adventure and opportunity. Thomas had fallen for her instantly. Her intelligence, her quiet strength, the way she could quote Shakespeare one minute and help birth a calf the next. She stood there with one hand pressed to her belly, 2 months pregnant with Thomas's child. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but she held herself straight, dignified. Even in grief, she refused to break. Ethan had met her only a handful of times. Thomas had kept his wife separate from his ranch life, protective in a way that now seemed prophetic. But Thomas had talked about her constantly, how she made him laugh, how she challenged him to be better, how excited she was about the baby. Now she stood alone. Constance Hartley hadn't so much as looked at her daughter-in-law during the service. Victor stood on the opposite side of the grave, his face blank. The rest of the family, such as it was, formed a wall of black cloth and cold shoulders. After the burial, as people dispersed toward their wagons and horses, Ethan approached Grace. She stood looking down at the fresh earth, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Mrs. Hartley. She turned, and up close he could see the exhaustion in her face. The kind of tired that came from crying until there were no tears left, then crying some more anyway. Mr. Blackwood, Thomas spoke of you often. He was my brother, not by blood, but by choice. A sad smile touched her lips. He said that exact phrase, many times. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Ethan struggled to find words that didn't sound empty. Finally, he just spoke the truth. Thomas asked me to watch out for you and the baby. If you need anything, anything at all, you send word. Thank you. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's very kind. Well, it's not kindness, it's a promise. She looked at him, then really looked, and something in her expression shifted, like she'd seen something in his face that gave her the first small measure of comfort since Thomas died. He chose his friends well. He chose his wife even better. Grace's eyes filled with tears again. She turned away, and Ethan let her go. Let her walk back to the wagon that would take her to the small house on the edge of town where she and Thomas had lived, where she'd now live alone, at least until the baby came. He watched her climb into that wagon, watched it roll away down the muddy street, and he wondered if Thomas had known, if somehow he'd sensed what was coming, and that's why he'd made Ethan swear that oath by firelight, brothers by choice, bound by blood, until death and beyond. Ethan meant to keep that promise, but he didn't know yet what it would cost him. Didn't know that in 6 months he'd be standing in a dusty street with 3 men facing him down and a pregnant widow depending on him for survival. The future was coming, fast and hard and bloody. Victor Hartley sat in his dead brother's study in what had been his father's house and was now legally his mother's property. But not for long. Victor had plans. He was 38 years old and had lived his entire life in Thomas's shadow. The younger brother who was smarter, stronger, more beloved. The golden child who could do no wrong while Victor stumbled through life, making mistakes their father never let him forget. And now Thomas was dead. Victor had killed him. Shot off a round from cover, spooked. Midnight watched his brother fall and get trampled. It had been easier than expected. Quick. Almost merciful compared to how Victor had suffered all these years. He felt no guilt, only satisfaction and a growing hunger to finish what he'd started. The problem was Grace and the child she carried. If the baby was born and recognized as Thomas's heir, it would inherit everything. The ranch, the mine, all of it. Victor would remain where he'd always been, on the outside looking in, with just his 30% and a lifetime of bitter resentment. But if Grace could be discredited, if the baby could be proven illegitimate, or better yet, if Grace could be driven away before the child was born, then Victor would be the only male Hartley left standing. His mother would have no choice but to make him heir to everything. He pulled out a piece of paper, began making notes. A campaign carefully orchestrated. First plant doubts. Whispers about Grace's character. Had she really been faithful to Thomas? The baby was conceived awfully quickly after the wedding. Maybe it wasn't Thomas's child at all. Reverend Marshall could be useful there. The man was deeply in debt from gambling a secret Victor had learned months ago. A generous donation to the church, some careful suggestions about moral responsibility, and Marshall would start preaching about the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of fallen women. Then there was Mrs. Patterson, the biggest gossip in town. A few carefully dropped hints in her presence would spread faster than wildfire. By the time the baby was born, Grace's reputation would be destroyed. She'd be forced to leave. The child would be raised by the Hartley family away from its mother. And Victor could control the narrative, could raise the boy to believe whatever Victor chose to tell him. It was perfect, clean, no blood, no obvious crime, just the slow destruction of one woman's life. Victor smiled to himself, made a few more notes. Then he heard his mother's footsteps in the hall and quickly hid the paper. Constance couldn't know. Not yet. She still grieved. Thomas still believed the accident story. Learning that Victor had murdered her favorite son would turn her against him. Better to let her believe the lie, at least until Victor had secured his inheritance. Constance entered without knocking. She looked older than her 60 years, her face lined with grief. Victor, we need to discuss arrangements. Of course, Mother. I want Thomas's house, the one he shared with that woman. I want it sold. Grace is living there. She's pregnant. We can't just, I can do whatever I want. Thomas bought that house with family money. It reverts to the family. Constance's voice was ice. That woman trapped Thomas into marriage, got herself pregnant to secure her position. Now Thomas is dead and she expects to live off his name. I won't have it. Victor hid his satisfaction. His mother was making this easier than he'd hoped. What do you want me to do? Evict her. Give her 30 days to vacate. She can find somewhere else to birth her bastard. Mother, the child is legitimate. Thomas married her properly. The marriage was a mistake. Thomas realized it before he died. He told me so. That was a lie, Victor knew. Thomas had been devoted to Grace, but his mother's grief had twisted into anger, and she needed someone to blame. Grace was convenient. I'll handle it, Victor said. 30 days. After Constance left, Victor sat back in his chair and considered the pieces falling into place. His mother's grief-driven rage would do half his work for him. All Victor needed to do was push things along, plant more doubts, make Grace's life so miserable she'd leave on her own. And if she didn't leave willingly, well, Victor had other options. He knew men, dangerous men, the kind who didn't ask questions if the money was right. One way or another, Grace Hartley would be gone before summer ended, and Victor would finally have what should have been his all along. The slow poison April became May, became June. Grace Hartley watched her life crumble like a cliff face in a rock slide, inevitable and unstoppable. It started small. The silence that fell when she entered the general store. The way Mrs. Patterson clutched her daughter's hand and steered the girl away like Grace carried some contagious disease. The Sunday sermon where Reverend Marshall spoke at length about the sanctity of marriage and the terrible price of sin, his eyes finding Grace in the congregation like a hawk spotting prey. Then it got worse. She lost her teaching position. The school board called a special meeting, didn't invite her, and voted unanimously to terminate her employment, effective immediately. When Grace went to clear out her classroom, she found the door locked and her belongings in a box on the steps. Mr. Henderson at the general store stopped extending credit. Cash only, he said, not meeting her eyes. And maybe she should shop elsewhere anyway. The boarding house where she'd moved after being evicted from Thomas's house gave her notice. Mrs. Grady was very sorry, but the other boarders were uncomfortable. Perhaps Mrs. Hartley could find accommodations elsewhere. By July, Grace was living in a single room above the saddle shop, the cheapest place she could find. She sold her jewelry, her good dresses, everything of value just to pay rent and buy food. The baby grew inside her, visible now at 4 months. She had no doctor's care, no friend to turn to, no family to help. The isolation was worse than the poverty. Grace could handle being poor. She'd grown up without money, worked her way through normal school by teaching children in the evening. She knew how to make do with little, but the loneliness ate at her like acid. To walk down the street and have people cross to the other side. To overhear women whispering behind gloved hands. To see the contempt in their eyes when they looked at her swelling belly. She'd done nothing wrong. Nothing. She'd loved Thomas faithfully, mourned him, honestly carried his child with pride. But somehow that didn't matter. The town had decided she was guilty of something, and in a place like Silver Ridge, once judgment was passed, there was no appeal. Grace began to understand what Thomas had feared, what he'd seen in Victor's eyes those last weeks before his death. The ruthlessness, the willingness to destroy anything that stood between Victor and what he wanted. Because this campaign of whispers and isolation had Victor's fingerprints all over it. Grace saw him sometimes watching from across the street. He never spoke to her directly, never had to. His mere presence was a reminder that he had the power to crush her whenever he chose. One August evening, Grace sat in her tiny room as the sun set her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. 5 months now. 4 months until she'd hold Thomas's child in her arms. 2 months to survive in a town that wanted her gone. She'd written to Ethan Blackwood once, a carefully worded letter asking if his offer of help still stood. But she'd never sent it. Pride, maybe. Or fear that even he would turn away once he knew how completely she'd been cast out. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. Grace whispered to the child she hadn't yet met. Your father was a good man, the best man I've ever known. And no matter what they say about me, about us, you are his son, his legacy. and I will protect you. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered how. She had no money left, no home, no way to support a child once it was born. The darkness gathered outside her window. Grace lit a candle, watched the small flame push back the shadows. It didn't do much, but it was something. Tomorrow she'd wake up and try again. That's all she could do, try again. Survive another day, keep going until she couldn't anymore. She didn't know that in 1 month everything would reach its breaking point, that Victor's patience would run out and he'd send men in the night to finish what Whispers had started. She didn't know that Ethan Blackwood was about to learn just how far evil could reach when good men looked away. The end was coming, not the end she feared, but an end nonetheless, in a new beginning forged in gunfire and desperate choices. Late August, 3 weeks before Grace would be forced onto a stagecoach and exiled from Silver Ridge forever. Victor Hartley sat in the Red Canyon Saloon in Denver across from a man who called himself Snake Morrison. The name fit. Morrison had cold eyes and a way of moving that reminded Victor of a rattler sliding through grass, all smooth menace and coiled violence. $500, Victor said, keeping his voice low. Half now, half when it's done. Snake sipped his whiskey, considering. Killing a pregnant woman. That's the kind of thing that brings law down hard. I don't want her killed, not unless there's no other option. Victor leaned forward. I want her scared. Hurt, maybe. Enough that she leaves Colorado and never comes back. Can you do that? For 500, I can do that and more. Snake smiled, showing yellow teeth. When, soon, she's 6 months gone. I want this finished before the baby's born. They shook hands on it. Victor left $250 on the table, gave Snake directions to Blackwood Ranch, where he'd learned Grace was staying occasionally, then walked out into the Denver night feeling lighter than he had in months. Soon this would all be over. Grace would disappear. The baby would be born to a broken woman in some distant town, no threat to Victor's inheritance. He'd finally have everything that should have been his from the start. He didn't think about the men he'd hired, didn't wonder what kind of person took money to terrorize a pregnant widow. That wasn't his concern. All that mattered was the result. 3 nights later, Snake Morrison and 2 other hired guns rode toward Blackwood Ranch under a moonless sky. Ethan Blackwood woke to the sound his years as an Army Scout had trained him to recognize. Horses moving too careful, men trying to be quiet, the particular quality of silence that meant danger approaching. He was dressed and armed in seconds, moving through his house like a ghost. Grace was asleep in the guest room down the hall, exhausted from another day of fighting morning sickness that plagued her even this late in pregnancy. Ethan had brought her here 2 weeks ago after finding her collapsed in the street outside the saddle shop. She'd been too weak to refuse, too desperate to maintain the pride that had kept her from asking for help sooner. Now 3 men were riding toward his ranch in the dead of night, and Ethan's instincts screamed that they weren't here for anything good. He woke his ranch hands quietly. 6 men, all good with weapons, all loyal. They positioned themselves around the main house, rifles ready, waiting. The attackers came in fast, expecting surprise. They got a gunfight instead. The sound of the first shot cracked across the ranch yard like lightning. Ethan fired from the porch, aiming for the lead rider's shoulder. The man screamed and jerked sideways, nearly falling from his horse. More shots followed, muzzle flashes in the darkness. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Ethan's men fired from the barn from behind the water trough, creating a crossfire that drove the attackers back. One of the hired guns got close to the house. Ethan saw him dismount, saw the knife in his hands, saw the intent in his eyes as he moved toward the window of Grace's room. Ethan didn't think, just moved. He vaulted the porch railing, crossed the yard in 4 long strides, and hit the man like a battering ram. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt. The knife slashed toward Ethan's throat. He caught the wrist twisted, heard bone crack. The man screamed. Ethan pinned him, fist raised. The man below him wasn't much older than 20. Scared eyes, breathing fast. Just a kid who'd taken money to do something evil and now realized he might die for it. Who sent you? Ethan's voice was cold as winter iron. The kid shook his head. Ethan hit him once, controlled but hard. Who sent you? Hartley. The word came out broken, desperate. Victor Hartley. Paid us to grab the woman. Said she was a whore. Said nobody would care. Ethan felt rage like fire in his chest. He wanted to keep hitting, wanted to make this kid pay for every bit of fear Grace had suffered. But gunshots still echoed across the yard, and Grace was inside, probably terrified. He knocked the kid unconscious with one more punch, then ran back to the house. Grace stood in the doorway of her room, pale and shaking her hands pressed to her swollen belly. "Ethan, it's over, you're safe." The other two attackers were already riding away, one wounded, leaving their unconscious companion behind. Ethan's men wanted to chase them down. He ordered them to let it go. The message had been sent. Anyone coming for Grace would have to come through Ethan Blackwood first. He found Grace in the parlor afterward, wrapped in a shawl despite the August heat, trembling. Shock, maybe, or just the accumulation of too much fear over too many months. Ethan poured her tea, made her drink it. Then he sat across from her and spoke the truth he'd been avoiding since he brought her to the ranch. "This won't stop. Victor wants you gone, and he'll keep sending men until he gets what he wants." "I know." Her voice was small, defeated. "The law won't help. Sheriff Coleman is in Victor's pocket. The town's already judged you. You have no protection." "I know that too." Ethan took a breath. This was the moment, the choice that would change everything. "There's one way to protect you and the baby. One way that gives you the Blackwood name and all the protection that comes with it." Grace looked up, confusion in her eyes. "Marry me." Ethan said it plain and simple. "No romance, no false promises. Not for love, for protection. You become my wife, the baby takes my name, and Victor loses any legal claim. I swear I'll protect you both with my life, but this is the only way I know to keep you safe." The silence stretched out. Ethan waited, knowing this was asking the impossible. She'd loved Thomas. Still loved Thomas. Taking another man's name, even in a marriage of convenience, would feel like betrayal. But Grace surprised him. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and in her eyes he saw not weakness but steel. The same strength that had kept her going through months of isolation and cruelty. "Yes," one word spoken clear and firm. "I'll marry you. You understand what this is." "What it isn't. I understand I'm 6 months pregnant, alone, and men just tried to hurt me and my child. I understand you're offering safety when no one else will, and I understand that Thomas asked you to protect us." Her hand went to her belly. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep this baby safe, even if it means marrying a man I barely know." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll get the judge tomorrow. We'll do this legal and proper. You'll have your own room, your own life. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to keep the promise I made to Thomas." "Thank you." Grace stood swaying slightly with exhaustion and the weight she carried. "For everything. For believing me when no one else would." She left him, then returning to her room. Ethan sat in the darkness of his parlor, listening to the night sounds return to normal. Crickets, wind, the distant call of a coyote. Tomorrow he'd ride into town and bring back Judge Morrison. Tomorrow he'd marry Thomas Hartley's widow and make himself a target for Victor's rage. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight he'd kept his promise. Grace was safe. The baby was safe. And Ethan Blackwood had learned something about himself he hadn't known before. When pushed to choose between safety and honor, he'd choose honor every time, even if it cost him everything. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky when Ethan finally went to bed. In 6 months, he'd be standing in a dusty street with 3 men trying to kill him. In 6 months, Grace would have his name and his protection, and Victor Hartley would be facing justice for murder. But tonight, for just a few hours, there was peace. Tomorrow would bring its own storms. It always did. In the West, you learned to take your rest when you could find it, because trouble never slept long. And trouble was coming. Fast and hard and bloody as a thunderstorm rolling down from the mountains. The only question was whether Ethan Blackwood and Grace Hartley would survive it together or die trying. September 1st, 1876. Dawn broke over Blackwood Ranch with the kind of clear light that made every detail sharp and vivid. The kind of morning that felt like a beginning, even when you knew it was also an ending. Ethan Blackwood stood on his porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold. In 2 hours, he'd be married. In 2 hours, Grace Hartley would become Grace Blackwood, and he'd make himself a target for every bit of rage and hatred Victor Hartley could muster. He was ready for it. Judge Morrison had arrived the night before, riding up from Denver, with his law books and his weathered face that had seen every kind of human foolishness the frontier could produce. He sat now in the ranch house drinking coffee with Mrs. Chen while they waited for the ceremony to begin. Grace emerged from her room wearing a simple gray dress, the only decent thing she owned that still fit over her 6-month belly. No white, no flowers, no pretense that this was anything but what it was. A transaction. Protection in exchange for a name. Safety bought with vows that meant everything and nothing at the same time. She walked toward Ethan, and he saw the dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept. Neither had he. Too much riding on what happened next. Ready? His voice was quiet, meant only for her. As I'll ever be. Grace managed a small smile. Thank you, Ethan, for doing this. Don't thank me yet. You're about to make yourself a target. I've been a target for months. At least now I'll have someone standing with me. They went inside. Mrs. Chen and 2 ranch hands served as witnesses. Judge Morrison opened his book, found the page he needed, and began to read the words that would bind them together in the eyes of God and the law. Marriage is an institution ordained for the mutual society, help and comfort that one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity. Morrison's voice carried the weight of 1,000 weddings performed across 1,000 dusty frontier towns. Into this holy estate, these 2 persons present come now to be joined. Ethan listened to the familiar words and thought about Rebecca, his first wife. The woman he'd loved with everything he had, who died screaming in childbirth while he held her hand and begged God for mercy that never came. He'd sworn then never to marry again, never to open himself to that kind of loss. This was different, he told himself. This wasn't about love. This was about honor, about keeping a promise to a dead man, about protecting a woman and child who had no one else. But when Morrison asked if he took Grace to be his lawfully wedded wife, and Ethan spoke the word yes, something shifted inside him, a door opening that he'd thought was sealed forever. Grace Hartley, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Grace's hand rested on her swollen belly. Inside, Thomas's child moved and kicked. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and he saw her making the same calculation he was, weighing what they were gaining against what they were sacrificing. I do. Her voice was clear, no hesitation. Ethan slipped a plain gold band onto her finger. Not the elaborate ring Thomas had given her, which Constance had reclaimed along with everything else. Just simple gold, honest and unadorned, like the promise it represented. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Morrison closed his book. You may kiss the bride. The moment stretched out awkward and strange. Ethan stepped closer and Grace lifted her face. He kissed her briefly, formally, his lips barely touching hers. It meant nothing. Everything. A seal on vows spoken without love, but with something deeper. Commitment born from necessity and honor. Mrs. Chen clapped, tears in her eyes. The ranch hands shuffled their feet, uncomfortable with witnessing something so private and public at the same time. They signed the papers. Morrison countersigned as officiant. Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands added their names as witnesses. And just like that, Grace Hartley ceased to exist. In her place stood Grace Blackwood, wife of the second most powerful rancher in 3 counties, protected by a name that carried weight and fear in equal measure. I'll file these in town this afternoon, Morrison said, rolling up the marriage certificate. By nightfall, everyone will know. Good. Ethan wanted no secrets, no room for Victor to claim the marriage was invalid. Let them know. After Morrison left, Ethan showed Grace to her room, the blue room he called it, at the east end of the house, with windows facing the sunrise. It had been his mother's room before she died. Now it would be Grace's sanctuary. You'll have privacy here, Ethan said, setting her small trunk by the door. Lock if you want. I'm at the other end of the hall. Mrs. Chen sleeps downstairs. You're safe. Grace walked to the window, looked out at the mountains. I haven't felt safe in so long, I'm not sure I remember what it feels like. You'll remember. Ethan moved toward the door. Rest. You need it. Ethan. She turned and he stopped. I know this isn't what you wanted. A pregnant widow, a ready-made family, all the trouble that comes with me. I know you're doing this because Thomas asked. But I want you to know I'll try to be a good wife, in whatever way this marriage needs me to be. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Left her there in the blue room with sunlight streaming through the windows, and went back to the hard work of running a ranch and preparing for the war he knew was coming. By sunset, word had spread through Silver Ridge like fire through dry grass. Ethan Blackwood had married the widow Hartley. Married her big and pregnant, married her in defiance of everything decent people believed about proper mourning and respectable behavior. The town erupted in scandalized gossip. Mrs. Patterson declared it proof that Grace had been carrying on with Ethan all along, probably while Thomas was still alive. Probably the baby was Ethan's, not Thomas's, and the whole tragic accident had been God's judgment on sin. Reverend Marshall preached a sermon about adultery and the wages of sin, never mentioning names but making sure everyone knew exactly who he meant. But nobody said anything to Ethan's face, because Ethan Blackwood wasn't Grace Hartley powerless and alone. Ethan was 6'2", of frontier hardness fast, with a gun rich enough to hurt anyone who crossed him, and known for keeping his word even when it cost him blood. The town could whisper all it wanted, but Victor Hartley's power to destroy Grace had just run into a wall it couldn't break through. Victor stood in his study reading the marriage notice Morrison had filed. His hands shook with rage. All his careful planning, all the money spent on hired guns and bribes and whispered campaigns, and now Blackwood had undone it all with a simple "I do." The baby would be born a Blackwood now. Grace was protected. Victor's claim to the Hartley fortune was slipping through his fingers like water. He needed a new strategy, something legal, something that would look legitimate in front of a judge. If he couldn't drive Grace away, maybe he could take the child. Prove Grace was unfit, claim custody rights as the child's uncle, as the remaining Hartley patriarch. Victor called for his lawyer. They had work to do. The first weeks of the marriage passed in a strange rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn, worked the ranch until sunset, came home exhausted and covered in dust. Grace spent her days helping Mrs. Chen with cooking and mending reading books from Ethan's small library, preparing for the baby that would arrive any day now. They were polite strangers sharing a house, careful around each other, both waiting for something to shift, though neither could say what. Mrs. Chen watched them with the knowing eyes of a woman who'd seen many marriages, good and bad. She'd come to America from China 40 years ago, married an Irish railroad worker, buried him after 10 good years together. She knew about love that grew from unexpected places. "You are too careful with each other," she told Ethan one morning as he saddled his horse. "Like walking on ice. Eventually the ice breaks. We have an arrangement. It works. Arrangements are for business. This is marriage. It's a marriage of protection, not love." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Love does not ask permission before arriving. It comes when it will, whether you want it or not." Ethan rode out before she could say more. He had cattle to move, fences to check, work that didn't require him to think about the woman living in his house, wearing his ring, and carrying another man's child. But at night, lying in bed, he heard her moving in the room down the hall, heard her footsteps when she couldn't sleep, which was often at 8 months pregnant, heard her quiet crying sometimes when she thought no one could hear. And something in him wanted to go to her, wanted to offer comfort, wanted to be more than just the name on a marriage certificate. He stayed in his room, kept his distance, because crossing that line meant opening himself to feelings he'd sworn never to feel again. Late September, Grace stood in the ranch yard watching Ethan teach a young colt to accept a saddle. His movements were patient, calm, talking to the animal in a low voice that soothed its fear. She'd been watching him for 3 weeks now, learning the man she'd married. He was nothing like Thomas. Thomas had been sunshine, always smiling, always quick with a joke. Ethan was shadow, quiet and watchful, his rare smiles like unexpected gifts. But there was kindness in him. She saw it in how he treated his horses, his ranch hands, even Mrs. Chen. Saw it in how he left books about childbirth on her bedside table without comment. Saw it in the way he'd made sure she had everything she needed without ever making her feel like a burden. She was starting to trust him. More than that, she was starting to care what he thought to notice when he came home to listen for his footsteps in the hall. It terrified her. The baby kicked hard, making her gasp and press a hand to her side. Ethan looked up, instantly alert. "You all right?" "Fine, the baby's just active today." He walked over, leading the colt. Up close, she could smell leather and horse and the particular scent of Ethan himself, masculine and earthy. Boy or girl, you think? Thomas wanted a son. Grace smiled sadly. But I hope for a daughter, someone who can be strong in a way women aren't usually allowed to be. She'll be strong either way, with you as her mother. The compliment caught Grace off guard. Ethan so rarely said personal things. She looked up at him, this man who'd married her out of duty and was solely without either of them meaning it to happen, becoming someone she depended on. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. I know this isn't easy for you. Nothing worth doing is easy. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect. Come on, Mrs. Chen has lunch ready. They walked to the house together, and for the first time since Thomas died, Grace felt something that wasn't grief or fear, just a quiet warmth, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. That night, the legal papers arrived, hand-delivered by a lawyer from Denver, official and intimidating. Ethan read them while Grace sat across from him, her hands clenched in her lap. His face went darker with each paragraph. They're suing for custody. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of calm that came before violence. Victor and Constance are claiming you're unfit to raise the child. They want guardianship. Grace felt the floor tilt. They can't. I'm the mother. They're claiming you married too quickly after Thomas's death, showing poor judgment, that you're living in sin with me, having conceived the child in adultery, that the child should be raised by blood family, not by a stepfather with no legal connection. But that's all lies. Doesn't matter if it's lies, matters if a judge believes it. Ethan set the papers down. We have to appear in court, November 15th, 6 weeks from now. 6 weeks. Grace felt panic rising in her throat. The baby would be born by then. She'd have to stand in front of a judge while the whole town watched and explain why she deserved to keep her own child. They're going to take my baby. The words came out broken. Ethan was around the desk and kneeling in front of her before she could blink. His hands covered hers, warm and solid. No, they're not. I swear to you, Grace. They will not take this child. We'll fight them. I'll hire the best lawyer in Colorado. We'll prove every word they said is a lie. What if that's not enough? His eyes met hers, gray and fierce. Then I'll do what the law won't. I'll protect you and this baby with my life if I have to. That's not a threat. That's a promise. Grace believed him. Looking into his face, seeing the absolute conviction there, she believed every word. Ethan Blackwood kept his promises, even when they cost him everything. She realized she was crying and tried to pull away, embarrassed. Ethan handed her his handkerchief, waited while she composed herself. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not usually so weak. You're not weak. You're 8 months pregnant, grieving your husband and fighting for your child. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. The next morning, Ethan rode into Silver Ridge with purpose burning in his chest. He needed answers, needed evidence, needed to find who killed Thomas and prove Victor's guilt before the custody hearing. He started at the silver mine where Thomas died. The site had been abandoned since the accident. The mine itself closed down. Constance claimed it wasn't profitable anymore, but Ethan suspected she just couldn't bear the reminder. He walked the area methodically, reading signs that were 6 months old but still visible to someone who knew how to look. The spot where the second horse had waited, the broken twigs, the crushed grass from where someone had knelt taking aim. He found the spent shell casing half buried in pine needles, .44 caliber, not a common round. Ethan pocketed it carefully. His next stop was the Red Canyon Saloon in Denver, where men with dangerous reputations drank and took jobs that couldn't be talked about in daylight. The bartender was a man named Riley who'd served Ethan whiskey many times over the years and knew when to talk and when to keep silent. I need information, Ethan said, sliding a $20 gold piece across the bar, about hired guns working in the area last spring, specifically anyone Victor Hartley might have used. Riley's eyes flicked to the gold, then to Ethan's face. Whatever he saw there made him decide. Snake Morrison, he bragged about a job last March. Said some rich rancher paid him to spook a horse. Thought it was funny the way it turned out. Ethan's hand tightened on his whiskey glass. Where can I find Morrison? He's usually here Thursday nights, plays poker in the back room. I'll be here Thursday. Ethan rode back to the ranch as the sun set his mind working through strategies. He had evidence now. Not enough for a murder conviction, but enough to raise doubts. enough to show Victor wasn't the grieving brother he pretended to be. But he needed more. Needed Morrison to confess. Needed something concrete that would stand up in court. Thursday night, Ethan returned to the Red Canyon. Morrison was exactly where Riley said he'd be, drunk and loud and stupid enough to run his mouth about jobs he should have kept quiet. Ethan waited until Morrison stepped outside to relieve himself, then followed him into the alley. Snake Morrison. The man turned, hand going to his gun, stopped when he saw Ethan already had his drawn steady and aimed. Blackwood, heard you got married. Congratulations. I want to talk about a job you did last March for Victor Hartley. Morrison's eyes went wary. Don't know what you're talking about. Ethan cocked his pistol. The sound was loud in the quiet alley. I can put a bullet in your leg and ask again, or you can save us both time and tell me what happened at the silver mine. Morrison looked at the gun at Ethan's face and made a calculation. He was drunk enough to be stupid, but sober enough to recognize genuine danger when it was pointing at him. $500. Victor wanted his brother's horse spooked. I fired a shot, horse panicked, Thomas fell. That's all I know. You knew he'd die. I knew he might. Victor said it didn't matter. You'll testify to that in court. Hell no, Victor will kill me. Ethan stepped in close to pressing the gun barrel to Morrison's knee. I'll kill you right now if you don't. Your choice. Quick bullet to the leg or I'll leave you bleeding in this alley and nobody finds you until morning. By then you'll have bled out nice and slow. Morrison's face went white. All right, I'll testify. Just don't shoot me. Ethan lowered the gun. You disappear before the trial, I'll hunt you down. Understand? I understand. Ethan left him there shaking and sweating and rode back into the night. He had his witness, had his evidence. Now he just needed Grace and the baby to survive the next 6 weeks. But Victor wasn't done, not by a long shot. The cattle stampede came on a clear October morning when Ethan was moving 500 head to winter pasture. His men were spread out along the herd, keeping them calm and moving steady. Then gunshots cracked across the valley, echoing off the canyon walls. The cattle panicked instantly. 500 animals, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, suddenly running in mindless terror. The sound was like thunder hooves pounding earth, bellowing and crashing. Ethan saw the riders on the ridge above. Victor and 4 of his men firing into the air, driving the herd toward a cliff edge that would send them plunging to their deaths. No time to think. Ethan spurred his horse forward, racing along the edge of the stampede. His men did the same, trying to turn the herd before it was too late. Samuel Chen misses. Chen's nephew and one of Ethan's best ranch hands cut in front of the lead steers, firing his pistol and yelling. The sound was lost in the thunder of hooves, but the steers saw him and started to turn. Ethan rode hard for the front of the herd, his horse straining beneath him. One slip, one fall, and he'd be crushed under thousands of pounds of terrified beef. His horse's hooves found purchase on loose stone. They slid, recovered, and kept running. The herd was turning, slowly, dangerously, but turning away from the cliff. But one of his ranch hands wasn't fast enough. Ethan saw the man's horse stumble, saw the rider thrown, saw the cattle bearing down. He didn't hesitate. Rode straight into the stampede, reached down and grabbed the fallen man by his shirt collar, hauled him up across the saddle. His horse screamed with effort, but kept running, carrying double weight out of the path of the herd. They made it clear with seconds to spare. The cattle thundered past, still running, but no longer headed for disaster. Ethan set the ranch hand down, made sure he was unhurt, then looked up at the ridge where Victor still sat on his horse. Even at this distance, Ethan could see the rage on his face. The plan had failed. The cattle were saved, but 50 head had broken away in the panic, scattered into rough country where they'd be held to fine. Weeks of work, thousands of dollars in losses. Victor was escalating. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about destroying everything Ethan had built, punishing him for daring to stand between Victor and what he wanted. The war was on, and it would end in blood one way or another. That night, Ethan came home, covered in dust and exhaustion. Grace met him at the door, her face pale with worry. Samuel told me what happened. Are you hurt? I'm fine. You could have been killed. Didn't happen. Ethan moved past her toward the stairs, wanting to wash and forget the rage still burning in his chest. Grace followed him. Ethan, please, talk to me. He stopped, turned, saw genuine fear in her eyes. Fear for him. This is my fight too, she said. Victor wants to destroy both of us. Don't shut me out. Ethan looked at this woman who'd lost everything, who was 9 months pregnant and still had more courage than most men he knew. You're right, I'm sorry. They went to the parlor. Ethan told her about Morrison, about the evidence he'd gathered about the case they were building. Grace listened, asked smart questions, offered insights he hadn't considered. Somewhere in that conversation, something changed. They stopped being strangers bound by a legal contract and became partners. Allies. Two people fighting the same war on the same side. When Grace stood to go to bed, she swayed slightly. Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her. You all right? Just tired. The baby's been active all day. Not long now. No, not long. She looked up at him, and in the lamplight, her face was beautiful and sad and strong all at once. Ethan, I need to tell you something. What? When I married you, I thought it would just be an arrangement. Protection in exchange for a name. But these past weeks, getting to know you, seeing who you really are. She paused, choosing her words. You're a good man. Thomas chose his friends well. And I'm grateful that you're the one standing with me through this. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. A door opening wider. Grace, I need you to know something too. This started as a promise to Thomas, but it's become more than that. I care what happens to you and to the baby. Not just because Thomas asked, because you matter. They stood there in the quiet house, and Ethan realized how close they were standing. Close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. Close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. He stepped back. You should rest. Long day tomorrow. Grace nodded, something like disappointment crossing her face. Good night, Ethan. Good night. He watched her climb the stairs, one hand on the railing, one on her swollen belly. And he wondered when exactly this marriage of protection had started feeling like something real. The night Grace's nightmare started, Ethan was jolted awake by the sound of her screaming. He was out of bed and down the hall in seconds, not bothering with a shirt or boots. Burst into her room to find her sitting up in bed, hands pressed to her belly, tears streaming down her face. Grace. She looked at him, eyes wide and terrified. I dreamed Thomas was dead and the baby was gone, and I was alone again. I dreamed it was all real and you were just another dream. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, careful to keep distance, but near enough to ground her. It was just a nightmare. Thomas is gone, that's true, but you're not alone, and the baby's fine. Feel. He took her hand, placed it on her belly where the baby was kicking strong and steady. Felt the life moving beneath his palm. Grace's breathing slowed. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have screamed. You can scream all you want. This is your home. She looked at him. Sometimes I still feel like a guest, like I'm waiting for you to realize what a mistake this was and send me away. Ethan's hand was still on hers, both pressed to her belly. This isn't a mistake, and you're not going anywhere. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Even after the baby's born, even after the custody case is settled, even then. They sat in the darkness, his hand covering hers, the baby moving between them. And Ethan realized with sudden clarity that somewhere in the past month, he'd stopped thinking of Grace as Thomas's widow. Started thinking of her as just Grace, a woman he admired, a woman he was starting to care for in ways that had nothing to do with promises to dead men. Ethan, her voice was soft, when you look at me, what do you see? The question caught him off guard. He thought about it, really thought about it. I see someone stronger than she knows. Someone who's been beaten down and keeps getting back up. Someone worth protecting, worth knowing. Not just Thomas's widow, not anymore. Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but different this time. I feel guilty, like I'm betraying Thomas by caring about you. Thomas would want you to be happy. How do you know? Ethan thought about his friend, about the man who'd made him promise to protect Grace. Because he loved you. And people who really love someone want them to survive, to heal, to find peace again. Even if that means moving forward. Grace leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Ethan put his arm around her, careful and gentle. They sat like that while the moon set, and dawn approached, not speaking, just being together. When Ethan finally left her room, the sun was rising. He'd held Grace while she slept, watched over her, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. The desire to protect someone, not out of duty, but out of love. He was falling for his wife. his pregnant, grieving temporary wife, and he had no idea what to do about it. The revelation came a week later, delivered by Samuel Chen with a grim expression. "Boss, you need to see this." Samuel handed him a letter, official looking, from the courthouse. Ethan read it, his jaw tightening with each line. The custody hearing had been moved up. November 1st, not November 15th. 2 weeks away, not 6. And there was more. Victor's lawyers had submitted new evidence. A letter supposedly written by Thomas to his mother expressing doubts about Grace's faithfulness, about whether the baby was really his. "It's fake," Ethan said. "Has to be." "That's what I thought, so I took the liberty of sending it to a handwriting expert in Denver." Samuel pulled out another letter. "Got his response this morning. The letter's a forgery. Not even a good one. Whoever wrote it tried to copy Thomas's hand, but didn't do it well enough to fool an expert." Ethan felt a grim satisfaction. Victor's getting desperate, making mistakes. Question is, can we prove it's Victor who forged it? Doesn't matter if we can prove he did it. Matters if we can prove it's fake. That'll be enough to destroy his credibility. Samuel nodded. "What about Morrison?" "He's still willing to testify." "He'll testify. I made sure of that." "Then we've got a case. Not perfect, but strong." Ethan looked out the window toward the mountains. 2 weeks until the hearing. 2 weeks until Grace would have to stand in front of a judge and defend her right to keep her own child. 2 weeks to make sure Victor Hartley's lies didn't destroy another innocent life. He found Grace in the kitchen helping Mrs. Chen prepare dinner. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the question in her eyes. "We need to talk," he said. They walked out to the porch away from listening ears. Ethan told her about the moved-up hearing, about the forged letter, about the evidence they had to fight back. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said simply, "We'll win." "You sound certain." "I have to be certain, because if I let myself believe we might lose, I'll fall apart. And I can't afford to fall apart right now." Ethan took her hand. The gesture was becoming natural, easy. "You won't fall apart, and you won't lose, I promise you that." Grace looked at their joined hands. "Ethan, I need to tell you something. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right," she took a breath. "When I married you, I was still in love with Thomas. Part of me still is. He was my husband, the father of my child. I'll always love him. But these past weeks living here, getting to know you, watching how you treat people, how you keep your promises even when it costs you." She looked up at him. "I've started to care about you, as more than just my protector, as more than just the man who married me out of duty. And I needed you to know that. Because after the hearing, after everything is settled, I don't want to keep living like polite strangers. I want this marriage to be real." Ethan's heart was pounding. "Grace, you don't have to say this because you feel obligated." "I'm not. I'm saying it because it's true. I'm saying it because I'm falling in love with you, Ethan Blackwood. And I think maybe you feel the same way." He did. God help him, he did. He'd been fighting it for weeks, telling himself it was too soon, too complicated, too much of a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But standing here with Grace looking up at him, brave and honest and beautiful in the fading light, Ethan couldn't fight it anymore. "I love you," he said. Simple. True. "I've been trying not to, trying to keep my distance. But I love you, Grace, and I swear I'll spend the rest of my life proving you were right to trust me." He kissed her, then properly this time. Not the brief, formal press of lips at their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and honest and full of everything they'd been holding back. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace smiled. "So this marriage is real now." "It's been real for a while. We were just too stubborn to admit it." They stood together as the sun set, and for the first time since Thomas died, Grace felt something other than grief. She felt hope. She felt love. She felt like maybe, just maybe, the future could be bright after all. But the future would have to be fought for. And the fight was coming sooner than either of them wanted. 2 weeks to the hearing. 2 weeks to gather evidence, prepare testimony, build a case strong enough to defeat the lies Victor had constructed. 2 weeks until they'd stand in that courtroom and fight for their right to be a family. The war wasn't over. It was just entering its final bloodiest phase. And when the smoke cleared, either Grace would hold her baby safe in her arms, or Victor would take everything she had left. There was no middle ground, no compromise, Just victory or devastation. Ethan Blackwood had never lost a fight that mattered. He didn't plan to start now. November 1st, 1876. The Silver Ridge Courthouse stood at the end of Main Street like a monument to frontier justice, 2 stories of whitewashed timber and glass windows that reflected the morning sun. By 8 o'clock, every seat inside was filled, and more people gathered outside, craning to hear what would happen when Grace Blackwood faced the judgment of the law. Ethan helped Grace down from their wagon, his hand steady under her elbow. She was 9 months pregnant now, the baby due any day. Walking was difficult, breathing harder. But she'd insisted on coming, refused to let Victor claim victory by default. "You can still wait at the ranch," Ethan said quietly. "I can represent you." "No." Grace's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "This is my child, my fight. I'll see it through." They walked into the courthouse together, and the crowd parted like water around rocks. Ethan kept his hand on Grace's arm, both supporting her and making a statement. This was his wife. Anyone who wanted to hurt her would have to go through him first. Victor Hartley sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer Donovan, a slick Denver attorney who'd made his fortune defending cattle barons and railroad men. Victor's face was a mask of righteous concern, but Ethan saw the hunger in his eyes. The desperate need to win, to take something from Grace that would finally make up for all the years of living in Thomas's shadow. Constance Hartley sat in the front row, dressed in black silk, her face carved from stone. She hadn't looked at Grace once since they entered, just stared straight ahead, waiting for justice as she understood it. Judge Thompson took his seat behind the bench, a man of 65 with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human foolishness the frontier could produce. He gavelled the court to order, and the murmur of conversation died. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Hartley versus Blackwood regarding custody of the unborn child of Thomas Hartley, deceased." Thompson's voice carried authority earned through 30 years on the bench. "Mr. Donovan, you may present your case." Donovan stood smoothing his vest. "Thank you, Your Honor. The facts of this case are simple and disturbing. Mrs. Grace Blackwood, formerly Hartley, married Ethan Blackwood a mere 6 months after her husband's tragic death. This unseemly haste suggests a relationship that predated Thomas Hartley's passing. Furthermore, the child she carries may not be Thomas Hartley's at all, but rather the product of an adulterous affair. Grace's hand tightened on Ethan's arm. He covered it with his own, keeping his face neutral. "The Hartley family seeks custody of this child to ensure it is raised in a proper moral environment by blood relatives who can provide the stability and respectability that Mrs. Blackwood clearly cannot." Donovan pulled out papers, began reading from what he claimed was a letter from Thomas to his mother, expressing doubts about Grace's faithfulness. The words were poison, each sentence designed to destroy Grace's character, to make her seem unworthy of motherhood. When Donovan finished, Judge Thompson looked to the defense table. "Mr. Harrison, your response." Harrison stood. He was 50 years old, with the weathered face of a man who'd fought his battles in courtrooms instead of streets, but fought them just as hard. "Your Honor, the letter Mr. Donovan just read is a forgery. I have here the sworn testimony of Samuel Hendricks, a handwriting expert from Denver, who examined the document and concluded definitively that it was not written by Thomas Hartley." He passed the document to the judge. "Furthermore, I have testimony that will prove not only Mrs. Blackwood's innocence, but will reveal that Victor Hartley has been conducting a systematic campaign to destroy her reputation and claim the Hartley fortune for himself." The courtroom erupted. Judge Thompson's gavel cracked like gunfire. "Order, I will have order in this court." Donovan was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous speculation with no basis in fact." "Then you won't mind if we present our evidence," Harrison said calmly. "I call Jacob Miller to the stand." Jacob Miller walked to the witness box, a man of 45 whose hands were scarred from years working the silver mine. He'd been terrified when Harrison first approached him, knowing that testifying against Victor Hartley could cost him his job, maybe his life. But Harrison had promised protection, and more importantly, had appealed to Miller's conscience. "Mr. Miller," Harrison began, "can you tell the court where you were on March 25th of this year?" "I was working the Hartley silver mine, morning shift." "And did you see anything unusual that day?" Miller swallowed hard, looked at Victor, then at Grace. Something in Grace's face, the quiet dignity with which she bore these attacks, gave him courage. "I saw Victor Hartley riding toward the mine entrance, around 9 in the morning." "Did you see what he did?" I was up on the ridge checking a support beam. I had a clear view down to where Thomas Hartley was inspecting the ore samples. I saw Victor ride to about 50 yards distance, dismount, pull his rifle, and fire a shot into the air. The courtroom went silent. What happened next? Thomas's horse Midnight, spooked bad, reared up, threw Thomas, then trampled him. Victor watched the whole thing. Then he rode away. Did you report this to anyone? Miller's voice dropped. No, sir. I was scared. Victor Hartley's a powerful man. I got a family to feed. But you're reporting it now. Yes, sir, because what happened to Mrs. Hartley, what they're trying to do to her, it ain't right. Thomas Hartley was a good man. He'd want his wife and child protected, not persecuted. Donovan stood for cross-examination, tried to shake Miller's story, suggested he was being paid to lie. But Miller held firm, his testimony solid as bedrock. When Miller stepped down, Harrison called his next witness. The defense calls Snake Morrison. Morrison shuffled to the stand, looking like a man who'd made a deal with the devil and was now paying the price. He'd been arrested 3 days earlier on Ethan's information, charged with attempted kidnapping. Harrison had offered him a deal, testify truthfully, and the charges would be reduced. Mr. Morrison, did Victor Hartley hire you to harm Grace Hartley? Morrison nodded. Yes, sir, last August. $500 to scare her, hurt her if necessary, make her leave Colorado. Did you attempt to carry out this assignment? We did, rode to Blackwood Ranch one night, but Blackwood was ready for us. We had to retreat. By we, you mean me and 2 other men Victor hired. Donovan objected, argued the testimony was hearsay, inadmissible. But Judge Thompson overruled him. This was a custody hearing, not a murder trial. Different rules applied, the testimony went on. Harrison built his case piece by piece, showing Victor's conspiracy, his attempts to destroy Grace, his willingness to use violence and lies to get what he wanted. By noon, the case against Victor was overwhelming. Constance Hartley sat pale and shaking, her world crumbled, as she realized what her surviving son had done. Judge Thompson called a recess for lunch. Ethan and Grace went to a small room set aside for them, away from the staring crowds. Grace sat heavily in a chair, one hand pressed to her belly. We're winning. We are. Ethan knelt beside her. How are you feeling? Tired. The baby's been active all morning. She winced. Very active. Grace, Ethan's voice sharpened. Are you in labor? I don't think so. It's just, oh. Her face went white. My water just broke. Ethan was on his feet instantly. I'll get the doctor. No time. Grace gripped his hand, her nails digging in. The baby's coming now. Dr. Morrison was summoned from the courtroom. He examined Grace quickly, his face grave. The baby's coming fast. We need to get her to my office. Can she be moved? We don't have a choice. They carried Grace out through the back entrance to avoid the Creoles, took her to Morrison's clinic 3 blocks away. Ethan stayed with her, holding her hand through the pain, the fear of the exhausting work of bringing new life into the world. 6 hours later, as the sun set over Silver Ridge, a baby's cry filled the clinic. It's a girl, Morrison said, cleaning the infant and wrapping her in a blanket, strong and healthy. Grace reached for her daughter, tears streaming down her face. The baby had dark hair and brown eyes, and even in those first moments, Ethan could see Thomas in her features. The shape of her face, the way her tiny hand gripped Grace's finger. Emma, Grace whispered. Emma Rose Hartley. Ethan looked down at the child, felt something crack open in his chest. This was Thomas's daughter, his best friend's legacy, and Ethan had promised to protect her. She's beautiful, he said quietly. Grace looked up at him. She needs a father, a real father, not just a protector. I know. Will you be that for her? Will you raise her as your own? Ethan touched the baby's cheek, felt the softness of new skin, the warmth of new life. I swear it. She'll be my daughter in every way that matters. A knock at the door interrupted them. Judge Thompson entered, his face serious. I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to see the child. Grace's arms tightened protectively around Emma. Why? Because Victor Hartley is claiming the baby isn't Thomas's. That this proves his accusations were correct. Thompson's expression was apologetic. I need to see for myself. Grace reluctantly allowed the judge to look at Emma. Thompson studied the baby carefully, and Ethan saw the moment recognition dawned. the brown eyes that were distinctly Hartley, the small birthmark on the right cheek that Thomas had carried that his mother Constance had described in her testimony. "This child is undoubtedly Thomas Hartley's daughter," Thompson said. "The resemblance is unmistakable." He looked at Grace. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm ruling in your favor. You retain full custody. Victor Hartley's claim is denied." Relief flooded through Grace so powerfully she began to cry. Ethan held her, and Emma, both his own eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. "There's more," Thompson said. "Based on the testimony presented today, I'm ordering Victor Hartley's arrest for the murder of Thomas Hartley. Sheriff Coleman will take him into custody immediately." Ethan felt grim satisfaction. Justice, finally, not just for Grace, but for Thomas, for the friend he'd failed to protect. "Thank you," Grace said. "Don't thank me, thank your husband. He's the one who gathered the evidence, found the witnesses, built the case." Thompson tipped his hat. "Take care of that baby, Mrs. Blackwood. She's the future of the Hartley name now." After Thompson left, Ethan and Grace sat in the quiet clinic, Emma sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "It's over," Grace said. "Not quite." Ethan knew Victor, knew that a man like that wouldn't go quietly to jail in a hanging. "Victor will try something, one last desperate play. Then we'll face it together." "Together," Ethan agreed. They stayed at the clinic that night, Grace and Emma resting while Ethan kept watch. Tomorrow they'd return to the ranch. Tomorrow they'd start building the life they'd fought so hard to protect. But tonight they'd earned a moment of peace, a moment to hold new life and remember that sometimes, against all odds, the good did triumph. Victor Hartley sat in the Silver Ridge jail, his hands clenched around the bars of his cell. Arrested, charged with murder. His inheritance gone, his freedom gone, his future reduced to a rope and a scaffold. No, he wouldn't accept this. Couldn't accept this. He still had money, still had men who owed him favors. And he had rage burning so hot, it consumed every other thought. If he was going to hang, he'd make sure Grace Blackwood suffered first. Make sure Ethan Blackwood paid for destroying him. One last play, one final chance to take them both down. 3 hired guns waited at Devil's Canyon, sent by Victor's remaining contacts on the outside. Snake Morrison was already in custody, but Victor still had money and men willing to kill for it. The plan was simple. Wait for Blackwood to bring his wife and the baby home. Ambush them in the canyon where there was no escape. Kill everyone. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. By the time anyone found the bodies, Morrison and his men would be in Mexico, rich and untouchable. He checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was loaded. The other 2 men did the same. They settled in to wait patient as predators. The next morning, Dr. Morrison cleared Grace to travel. She was weak, exhausted from childbirth, but determined to go home. Emma was bundled in blankets, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that waited. Ethan drove the wagon himself, his rifle across his knees. He'd sent 2 ranch hands ahead to scout the road, but something in his gut told him trouble was coming. The same instinct that had kept him alive during his Army Scout days, when Apache raiders would wait in ambush and only the careful survived. They entered Devil's Canyon around noon, the sun high overhead. The walls rose steep on either side, red rock and scrub pine. A perfect place for an ambush. Ethan's hand moved to his rifle. The first shot came from above, clipping the wood of the wagon seat inches from his head. Ethan reacted instantly, shoving Grace down to the floorboards. "Stay down, cover Emma." He grabbed his rifle, rolled off the wagon on the opposite side from the shooters. 3 men positioned on the canyon rim. Professional work, disciplined fire. But Ethan had fought Apache, had survived battles where one mistake meant death. He knew how to read terrain, how to use cover, how to make every shot count. He fired twice at the nearest shooter, saw the man jerk and fall. Levered another round, aimed at the second man who was trying to flank around. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The man dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder. Snake Morrison, the third shooter, came down from the rim on horseback, firing his pistol. Bullets spanged off, rock whined through the air. Ethan took cover behind a boulder, reloaded, waited for Morrison to get closer. The outlaw made a mistake, got overconfident, rode too close, thinking Ethan was pinned down. Ethan stepped out from cover, rifle at his shoulder. "Drop it, Morrison." Morrison tried to bring his pistol around. Ethan fired. The bullet took Morrison in the chest, punching him backward off his horse. He hit the ground and didn't move. The canyon went quiet except for the echo of gunshots fading into the distance. Ethan checked the other shooters. The first was dead. The second was wounded but alive. The third, Morrison, was dying, blood spreading across his shirt. Ethan knelt beside him. "Who sent you?" Morrison coughed blood. "Victor. Paid us to kill your wife and the baby. Guess he won't be paying the rest now." "Guess not." Morrison died 30 seconds later. Ethan felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just the cold certainty that some men chose death the moment they threatened the innocent. He went back to the wagon. Grace had Emma clutched to her chest, both of them unhurt but terrified. "Is it over?" "It's over." Ethan helped them both up. "Victor's last move. It failed." "Are they dead?" "Two of them. One's wounded. I'll send him back to town to testify about who hired them." Grace looked at the bodies, at the blood staining the canyon floor. This was frontier justice. Harsh and final and necessary. "I'm glad you were here. I'll always be here. For you and Emma. That's a promise. Why so I..." They continued home, and as they drove through the ranch gates, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in 9 months. Safety. True, deep, unshakable safety. The war was finally over. Victor's conspiracy exposed his hired killers, dead or captured. Emma was safe. Grace was safe. And Ethan Blackwood had proven once again that his promises were written in blood and honor, and nothing in heaven or earth could make him break them. News of the shootout reached Silver Ridge by evening. Sheriff Coleman, already embarrassed by his failure to investigate Thomas's death and his acceptance of Victor's bribes, moved quickly to contain the damage. He arrested Victor on additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Jacob Miller's testimony, Snake Morrison's deathbed confession as reported by the wounded gunman, the forged letters, the attempted kidnapping. Victor Hartley would hang, not just for killing his brother, but for everything that came after. The lies, the violence, the systematic destruction of an innocent woman's life. The trial was brief. 3 days of testimony, all of it damning. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Thompson sentenced Victor to death by hanging. Execution scheduled for December 15th. Constance Hartley sat through the trial in silence, her face a mask of grief. She'd lost both her sons now. One to murder, one lost to the hangman. The family she tried so hard to protect was destroyed, and she bore part of the blame. After the sentencing, she came to Blackwood Ranch. Ethan met her at the door, his face hard. "I'd like to see the baby," Constance said. "My granddaughter." Ethan wanted to refuse. This woman had been complicit in Grace's persecution, had tried to take Emma away, had turned a blind eye to Victor's evil. But Grace came to the door, Emma in her arms, and said quietly, "Let her in." They sat in the parlor, 3 people bound by tragedy and blood. Constance looked at Emma and began to cry. Silent tears that carved tracks down her weathered face. "She looks like Thomas, exactly like him at this age." "She does," Grace agreed. "I'm sorry." Constance's voice broke. "For everything I did to you, everything I allowed Victor to do, I was blind, stupid. I let grief and pride poison me, and I nearly destroyed you." "You can't undo the past," Grace said, "but you can choose what happens next." Constance looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Emma deserves to know her grandmother, to hear stories about her father from the woman who raised him. I won't take that from her because of what you did to me. You'd allow that after everything, for Emma's sake, and because Thomas would have wanted it." Constance reached out tentatively. Grace let her hold Emma, watched as the baby gripped Constance's finger with tiny strength. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this right," Constance said. "I swear it." "Start by being a good grandmother," Grace replied. "That's all I ask." Ethan watched this exchange and felt something shift. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The strength to move forward instead of staying trapped in past hurts. Maybe there was hope for healing after all. December brought snow to the high country, blanketing the ranch in white. Ethan and Grace settled into a rhythm, learning to be parents to Emma, learning to be husband and wife in truth instead of just on paper. One evening, with Emma asleep in her cradle and a fire crackling in the hearth, Grace told Ethan she had something to show him. "I found this in Thomas's things." Things Constance returned after the trial. She held out a letter yellowed with age, sealed, but never sent. It's addressed to you. Ethan opened it carefully, recognizing Thomas's handwriting immediately. His hands shook as he read. The letter was dated March 20th, 5 days before Thomas died. Ethan, my brother and my friend, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Victor finally made his move. I've seen it coming for weeks, the way he looks at me, the cold calculation in his eyes. I'm writing this to tell you something I should have said at the campfire. If I die and you protect Grace as I asked, don't feel guilty about what comes next. Don't torture yourself thinking you've betrayed me. Grace deserves to be loved. She deserves happiness, safety, all the things I wanted to give her, but might not have the chance to provide. You're a good man, Ethan. Maybe the best man I've ever known. If she turns to you, if feelings develop between you, I want you to know I give my blessing. Love her if you can. Protect her always. Raise my child with the honor and strength I know you possess. And don't live in the shadow of my death. I want the people I love to find joy even after I'm gone, especially after I'm gone. Thank you for being my brother. Thank you for keeping your promise. And thank you for giving my family the protection I can't. Your friend always, Thomas. Ethan read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring with tears. Thomas had known, had understood, had given his blessing to the love that was growing between Ethan and Grace. He wanted us to be happy, Grace said softly. He wanted us to move forward. Ethan pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. I've been feeling guilty, like I was stealing something that belonged to him. You're not stealing anything. You're honoring what he wanted most, for his family to be protected and loved. And they sat together in the firelight, reading Thomas's words again, feeling the weight of his blessing settle over them like a benediction. That night, Grace moved her things from the blue room to Ethan's quarters, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because they were truly married now in every sense that mattered. 2 months later, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. She told Ethan on a February morning while he was getting ready to ride out and check the cattle. He stopped mid-motion, his boot halfway on. You're certain? Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday, about 6 weeks along. Ethan sat down hard on the bed. After Rebecca died in childbirth, he'd sworn never to risk loving someone that way again. Never to face the terror of watching a woman he loved go through that agony and danger. But this was Grace, and she was looking at him with such hope, such joy that his fear didn't matter. How do you feel about it? He asked. Terrified, excited, happy. She took his hand, placed it on her still flat belly. This is our child, Ethan, yours and mine. Emma will have a brother or sister. We'll be a real family. We already are a real family. I know, but this makes it feel complete somehow. Ethan pulled her into his arms, held her tight. I love you, Grace Blackwood, and I'll protect you and this baby with every day I have. I know you will. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace was careful, rested when she needed to let Ethan and Mrs. Chen care for Emma when the exhaustion became too much. Emma was walking now, taking her first wobbling steps across the ranch house floor, babbling in the language only babies speak. She had Thomas's eyes and Grace's smile, and she'd wrapped everyone around her tiny finger. Constance visited every week, bringing gifts for Emma, telling stories about Thomas as a boy. She was genuinely trying to make amends for her failures. And slowly, painfully, Grace was learning to forgive. Victor hung in December as scheduled. Constance didn't attend the execution. Neither did Grace or Ethan. Some endings didn't need to be witnessed. October 1877. Grace went into labor on a cool autumn morning, the leaves turning gold on the aspens outside. This time Ethan stayed with her through the whole process, held her hand, wiped her forehead, talked her through the pain. Dr. Morrison delivered the baby, a healthy boy with dark hair and gray eyes. James, Grace said, cradling her son. James Blackwood. Ethan held his son, his first biological child, and felt a completeness he'd never thought he'd experience again. He's perfect. He is. Grace looked at Emma, who Mrs. Chen was holding nearby. They both are. Emma toddled over to look at her new brother, reached out a chubby hand to touch his face. Baby, she said clearly. That's right, sweetheart, Grace said. Your baby brother. Ethan watched his family, this unexpected gift that had come from tragedy and promises and love that grew in the darkest soil. 2 children, one born of his best friend's love, one born of his own, both equally precious, both equally his. The ranch prospered over the next years. Ethan expanded the herd and improved the grazing land, built a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Grace started her school teaching children from the surrounding ranches and homesteads, giving them the education frontier life rarely provided. Emma grew into a bright, curious girl who loved books and horses in equal measure. James became his father's shadow-learning ranch work almost before he could walk comfortable in the saddle by age 4. Constance sold the Hartley Ranch, and mine moved into a small house near Blackwood property. She spent her final years being the grandmother she'd failed to be a mother, teaching Emma to sew, telling both children stories about their heritage, trying in small ways to atone for the damage she'd caused. She died peacefully in 1885, in her sleep with Grace and Emma beside her. Her last words were, "Tell Thomas I'm sorry." The years passed. Emma went to university in Denver, became a lawyer, one of the first women to practice law in Colorado. James took over the ranch, expanding it even further, marrying a woman named Sarah, and starting his own family. Grace and Ethan grew old together, their love deepening with each year. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the mountains turn purple in the sunset, holding hands and remembering all they'd survived. November 1891. 15 years after the day Ethan had married Grace in a desperate bid to protect her. The ranch had grown into an empire. 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, 200 head of quality cattle, a reputation that extended throughout Colorado and beyond. Grace's school had become an academy with 3 teachers and 85 students. She'd educated a generation of frontier children, given them tools to build better lives than their parents had known. Emma, now 15, was preparing to leave for university. Beautiful and brilliant, carrying Thomas's legacy and Ethan's protection, she was everything Grace had hoped for. James, 13, was already running parts of the ranch operation, showing the same instinct for the land that Ethan possessed. A family dinner, 4 generations if you counted Constance's memory. Grace and Ethan, now 41 and 50 respectively, Emma and James, and the future waiting to be written. Emma asked the question she'd asked many times before. "Tell me about my father." Grace smiled, the pain of Thomas's loss long since softened into bittersweet memory. "Your father was brave and kind. He loved deeply. He wanted the best for everyone around him, especially for you, even though he never got to meet you. I wish I'd known him." "You do know him," Ethan said. "You carry him in your heart and your strength in the way you fight for what's right. That's all Thomas, all the best parts of who he was." Emma looked at Ethan, this man who'd raised her as his own, who'd never once treated her as anything less than his daughter. "But you're my father too, the one who taught me to ride, to shoot, to stand up for myself. The one who's been there my whole life." Ethan's eyes grew bright. "You had 2 fathers, one who gave you life, one who raised you. Both loved you. Both wanted you to be strong and free and happy." "That's not fair to most people," Emma said. "Having 2 fathers who loved them." "No," Grace agreed. "It's not fair. It's a gift. And you should honor that gift by living a life that makes them both proud." Later, after the children were in bed, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch as they had 1,000 times before. The November air was cold, promising snow, but neither of them wanted to go inside yet. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Taking on a pregnant widow and all the trouble that came with her?" Ethan laughed quietly. "Every day. I regret that I didn't find you sooner, that you had to suffer alone for so long, that Thomas died before he could see Emma grow up. But not marrying me." "Never that. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Even when I told myself it was just to keep a promise, part of me knew the truth." "What truth?" "That I was already falling in love with you. That first day when I found you collapsed in the street, I saw strength in you that most men don't possess. And I knew even then that you were someone worth fighting for." Grace leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, comfortable and right. "We've built something good, haven't we? We've built something that'll last, a family, a legacy, something worth passing on." In Denver, 1905, Emma Blackwood sat at her desk in her law office, successful and respected, one of the few female lawyers in Colorado. She just finished a case defending a widow's property rights, and she thought about her mother, about everything Grace had endured. She pulled out paper and pen, began writing a letter to her own daughter, Rose, who was 3 years old and already showing signs of the family's strength. My dearest Rose, I want to tell you about your grandparents, about the courage it takes to survive when the world tries to destroy you, about the love that can grow from the darkest circumstances. Your grandmother Grace was pregnant and alone when my father died. The town turned against her, tried to drive her away, tried to take me from her before I was even born. But she refused to break. She survived because she was stronger than they knew. Then a cowboy named Ethan Blackwood made a promise to a dying man. He married your grandmother to protect her. He didn't love her then, but he kept his word even when it cost him everything. And from that promise, from that marriage built on honor, instead of romance, grew a love story more powerful than any fairy tale. They chose each other every day for 30 years. They built a ranch, a school, a family that spans generations. I had two fathers, Thomas Hartley, who gave me life and died protecting what he loved, and Ethan Blackwood, who raised me, loved me, taught me to be strong. I tell you this because I want you to understand something fundamental about our family. We don't give up. We don't let others define us. We fight for what's right, protect those who can't protect themselves, and keep our promises even when the cost is high. You come from warriors and teachers, from cowboys and lawyers, from people who chose love and honor over comfort and safety. Never forget that, and never let anyone make you feel less than the fierce, brilliant person you are. With all my love, your mother, Emma. She sealed the letter, put it in her desk drawer. Someday when Rose was old enough, she'd read it, and she'd understand what it meant to be part of this family. Grace and Ethan Blackwood lived to see their grandchildren grow, to watch Emma build her law practice, to see James expand the ranch into one of the finest operations in Colorado. They died within months of each other in 1910, Grace at 60 and Ethan at 69. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains they both loved. The headstone read simply, Grace Blackwood, 1850 to 1910, beloved wife, mother, teacher. Ethan Blackwood, 1841 to 1910, beloved husband, father, keeper of promises. Below that, added later by Emma, from duty grew honor, from honor grew love, from love grew a legacy that will never die. And in a frame in Emma's law office, hanging where she could see it every day, was a photograph taken in 1905. 3 generations of Blackwoods and Hartleys. Grace and Ethan older, but still holding hands. Emma and James with their families. Children playing at their feet. A family built on tragedy and promises on violence, and Grace on the simple truth that sometimes the strongest love grows from the hardest soil. Sometimes a cowboy's promise to a dying friend becomes something more, becomes a marriage, a family, a legacy. Sometimes the widow society tried to destroy becomes the woman who changes everything. And sometimes in the harsh frontier of 1870s, Colorado justice actually prevails. Love actually conquers, and promises actually matter. The story of Grace and Ethan Blackwood lived on in the family they built, in the school that still bore Grace's name, in the ranch that 4 generations would work and love and call home. They'd started with nothing but a desperate promise and a legal contract. They'd built an empire of love and honor that would last long after they were gone. That was their legacy. That was their triumph. And that in the end was enough.